Hi, and welcome to another in my series of videos on the Gospel of John. In this video, we're going to be looking at the situation behind John's Gospel. Who exactly was John writing for? We've seen that the fourth Gospel was written by the beloved disciple, most likely John, son of Zebedee, between 80 and 100 CE or so, and the version that circulated was edited by his students, probably just after John's death. But who were those students? Who was the audience John had in mind when he wrote? Scholars of John will often talk about the Johannine community as John's audience. This reflects the general tendency since the mid-20th century to think about the Gospels as contextual documents. With one of Paul's letters, it's clear that the apostle was writing to address a particular situation. His message is shaped for the ears of a particular group. So we have to reconstruct that group and their situation if we want to understand what Paul is trying to say in the letter. It's like listening to one end of a phone conversation and hearing the speaker say, "No, not yet, she's overdue." Does this mean that some woman hasn't returned her library books? Or does it mean that she's going to give birth any day? If we eavesdrop some more, we might get more clues about the situation, and if we know something about the speaker, it might help too. Does he have a wife or a sister who's pregnant? Does he work at a library reception desk? We might piece together that it's the speaker's parent on the other end. That'll probably rule out the library book scenario. Like it or not, though, we have to imagine some hearer and some situation behind the conversation in order to make any sense of his words. The movement, known as redaction criticism, argued this same thing in relation to the Gospels. Redaction just means editing. And in the 20th century, scholars rightly realized that each of the Gospels is more than just a play-by-play transcript of Jesus' words and actions. The Gospel authors, or editors, choose what to include, arrange the episodes and sayings in a particular order, rephrase and interpret each piece. In other words, the Gospels are written to make a particular point. Each one is an argument as much as a record. So to some degree, we have to reconstruct the audience on the other end of that argument in order to understand it. Mark's Gospel, for example, puts a huge emphasis on the weakness and foolishness of the 12 disciples during Jesus' lifetime. That means one thing if the audience holds the 12 in high regard as the founders of the faith. It means something else if that audience is resentful of the 12 and sees themselves as independent. In the latter case, Mark's theme is an argument against the authority of the 12. In the former case, though, it's a more nuanced argument, that since even the 12 were human and fallible, the audience who revere them should expect to be fallible too, and that's okay. The same gospel text, but the argument it makes sounds very different depending on which audience we imagine. Now, starting in the 1990s, some scholars have pushed back against this focus on gospel audiences. They've argued that the Gospels were all written for broad publication, so the writers didn't have any one community in mind. Redaction criticism tended to talk as if each evangelist's church was an isolated island. Each Gospel was written only to be read by that one church community. It's true, though. It's true, too, that some documents are less contextual. Some documents are less like a phone conversation and more like a TED Talk. I don't have to know very much about the audience of a TED Talk in order to grasp what the speaker's getting at. Why? Because the speaker themselves doesn't know the audience, so the argument isn't going to assume anything specific about them. The speaker also knows that the talk is going to be rewatched for years on the internet by people all around the world, so they'll probably go out of their way to frame the argument in a way that doesn't rely even on a knowledge of, say, immediate political events. So which is John's Gospel? Is it more like a phone conversation with a friend, or more like a recorded TED Talk? Most scholars would say it's somewhere in between. With the fourth Gospel in particular, older scholars have often assumed that the community was highly sectarian, cut off from other branches of early Christianity, so it was written to be read only by that isolated Johannine church. Some even argued that whole episodes in John were extended allusions to events in the church's own history. But there isn't actually a lot of evidence for that kind of isolation in the Johannine community. After all, the Johannine writings were very quickly copied and used by churches around the whole Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. How would this happen if they were cut off on their own? No, John probably wrote with an awareness that his words would be read and used beyond his own church. At the same time, we'll see in a moment signs in John that the writer is telling Jesus' story in a way that addresses particular needs that are most likely present in his community. To this extent, John's Gospel might be a bit like a sermon given by a really popular pastor to their own home congregation. The immediate focus on what those people in the room need to hear is real. The pastor knows them, knows they're going through some really tough times, so the message is geared to help them through that situation. At the same time, though, the pastor's also aware of the video camera off to the side. They know that in parts of the sermon, the full significance of their words will be lost on the people who live stream the sermon from across the continent. That's okay. But the pastor makes sure not to rely so much on shared knowledge with the audience that those distant watchers miss the point completely. John probably had this kind of dual focus as he wrote, telling the story of Jesus in a way that helps his own community deal with their own traumas, while making sure that the book will also still serve a broader audience too. So where was that Johannine community? Early church writers unanimously tell us that John ended his life in the city of Ephesus in Asia Minor. That's about a third of the way up the western coast of what's now Turkey. There's little in the fourth gospel itself to confirm that Ephesus was the location, but neither is there any reason it couldn't have been Ephesus. The arguments against that city have usually assumed, again, that the Johannine community was highly separatist and isolated. And just because Paul founded the church in the 50s CE doesn't mean John's teaching would sound at all like Paul 40 years later. Ephesus was a port city. It was the transfer point between sea trade across the Aegean and land routes across Asia. It was also the meeting point of two major land routes, one running north-south along the coast and the other running east-west inland. So Ephesus would have been cosmopolitan, wealthy, with a sophisticated elite. Culturally, Ephesus had been part of the Greek world for centuries. Greek was the native language. And although the Romans were now ultimately in charge, Ephesians would have had a strong sense of their ancient tradition and dignity. Even more than in most other major Hellenistic cities, though, the older, more Asiatic culture that was represented in things like the images that were made of Artemis in the city of Ephesus could still be seen fused with that Greek culture, creating a kind of unique hybrid that couldn't be found many other places. The massive temple to Artemis on the outskirts of town was known as one of the wonders of the world. It drew religious pilgrims and tourists from around the Mediterranean, and the story in Acts suggests that religious tourism supported a thriving trade in things like votive images of the goddess. Those same stories in Acts reflect a lively belief in magic and divination among the people of Ephesus. At the same time, we should recognize that in many ways Ephesus was just like any of the other major eastern cities, Antioch, Alexandria, etc. To that extent, it may matter less exactly which city John lived in than it does the particular tensions that Christians in many of those cities seem to have experienced. It's almost certain that John's Christian community included a mixture of both Jews and Gentiles, mostly ethnic Greeks. The Ephesian church that Paul founded certainly included both ethnic groups, and the content of John's Gospel reflects that same kind of mixed audience. As we move through John, we're going to see that it is shot through with symbolism and allusions that refer to Old Testament stories or to first century Jewish practices. Only fellow Jews would pick up many of those references. Even more than that, though, one level of the book's whole argument addresses a very Jewish concern. Is Jesus the fulfillment of God's revelation to Israel, or is he, as many Jewish leaders had charged, a dangerous traitor, undermining Israel's covenant relationship with God? The constant prominence of this very Jewish question suggests an audience that was in large part Jewish. At the same time, though, John's translation of Jesus' language and imagery makes it more accessible to non-Jews. John frames the argument about Jesus in universal symbols like light and darkness, heaven and earth, life and death. Jews in his audience hear the uniquely Jewish level of meaning in those terms and understand the argument John's making about Jesus and Israel. But non-Jews with no background in the Old Testament will still hear something meaningful. The claim that the source of divine light and endless life, the teacher who knows the secrets of the cosmos, is inviting them into relationship with himself. John's language is multi-layered. accessible at a superficial level to Gentiles with no background in Israel's tradition, but at a deeper level addressing Jewish anxieties with deeply Jewish claims. All of this seems to confirm that John's audience of urban believers includes both a significant core of Jews and a significant number of Greeks, some of whom were probably not familiar with Judaism before they came to hear about Jesus. There's also evidence in the gospel itself that the audience, or at least its Jewish members, had recently been kicked out of the synagogue community in Ephesus. They'd essentially been excommunicated. The most compelling evidence for this is the book's use 3 times of a Greek technical term, aposynagogos. This word seems to have meant banned from the synagogue in a formal sense. Someone who was declared aposynagogos by a local synagogue would be kept from entering the building or participating in any of the activities there. This was especially significant because synagogues weren't just places for prayer and study on the Sabbath. They also served as community centers for the Jews in a city. So being barred from the synagogue would have meant being excluded from much of the Jewish community's life. Evidence from rabbinic literature seems to suggest that anyone expelled like this was to be shunned by fellow Jews. So it's a drastic punishment suffered by the blind man healed by Jesus when, in chapter 9, verse 22, he is made aposynagogos. In chapter 12, as John sums up Jesus' public activity, he tells us again that many, even of the authorities, believed in him, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess it, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. The word used there is, again, aposynagogos. Most historians doubt that followers of Jesus were actually being expelled from synagogues systematically like this during Jesus' lifetime. Paul seems to have met stiff opposition in some synagogues in the 50s, but more often he was able to come and go in a synagogue community without a lot of trouble. There's widespread evidence that Jewish Christians often continued to participate actively in their local synagogue, at least until the end of the 1st century. Some historians will talk about a council of the emerging rabbinic leadership at a place called Yavna, or Jamnia, in 90 CE, and point to this event as the point when Jewish leadership decided to exclude believers in Jesus. The evidence for this is fuzzy, and the reality probably more complex. After all, there wasn't any centralized leadership structure in Judaism, especially after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. But around the end of the 1st century, there does seem to have been a strong movement to exclude early Christians. It's around this time that a new section was added to the synagogue prayer called the 18 Benedictions. One reconstruction of that edition's earliest form reads like this: "For the renegades let there be no hope, and may the arrogant kingdom soon be rooted out in our days, and the Nazarenes, i.e. the Christians, and the Minim, i.e. the heretics, perish as in a moment, and be blotted out from the book of life, and with the righteous may they not be inscribed. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humblest the arrogant." The point seems to have been that anyone harboring secret allegiance to Jesus, or to any other illegitimate branch of Judaism, would be forced to curse themselves. Since the larger prayer was a regular part of synagogue meetings, the change effectively prevented Jewish Christians from taking part in synagogue services. Now, since there was no central authority in Judaism, it would have taken time for this addition to spread. Its adoption would have been uneven. Nevertheless, it's around 90 CE that this process of deliberate exclusion of Christians was in full swing. Maybe it's not an accident, then, that it's around that same time John's Gospel is being written. So many scholars think the fear of expulsion from the synagogue in John's narrative is a projection backward of experiences that were very recent for the Gospel audience. Not that there wasn't any fear of religious authorities during Jesus' mission, and not that followers of Jesus weren't already ostracized on occasion, but John may, they suggest, have reframed those earlier fears in terms of synagogue expulsion, so that his later audience would recognize the connection with their recent experience. Faced with complete rejection by their community, the community that raised and formed them, it would have been tempting for John's hearers to simply keep their faith in Jesus a secret, or give it up entirely. The price was too high. So John shows us one healed man who refuses to give in to that fear, contrasted with those who let themselves be controlled by threats. The application to John's audience is drawn very directly by Jesus in his final speech on the night before his death. "I have said these things to you to keep you from stumbling. They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, an hour is coming when those who kill you will think that by doing so they are offering worship to God. And they will do this because they have not known the Father or me. But I have said these things to you, so that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told you about them. If we remember that John is paraphrasing and interpreting Jesus' words in this long speech, it's hard to avoid the impression that the evangelist is pointing to the audience's own recent trauma. They have, in fact, been put out of the synagogue. Or perhaps that crisis of expulsion is happening even as John writes. He may also know that Jewish Christians in other cities are going through the same painful rejection and isolation. If scholars are right about this crisis in John's community, it also helps us to understand the evangelist's strange use of the label, the Jews. We'll see later on how, in some scenes, John will label a particular group the Jews. Sometimes this is the crowd listening to Jesus. Sometimes it's a group of faceless religious authorities. Sometimes the Jews are divided in their reaction to Jesus. Often the label is applied to those who reject him. The weird thing about all of this is that everyone in these stories is Jewish. Jesus himself is Jewish. So are all of Jesus' disciples. When everyone in the scene is a Jew, why refer to only one group as the Jews? The most plausible explanation is that the Jewish believers in John's audience were being told they weren't Jews by the synagogue leadership. They were being told they were traitors to their people because they followed Jesus. They were being ostracized and shunned by their broader Jewish communities. In effect, then, John seems to be saying, fine, you can have the label the Jews. So where people show up in John's gospel who are like the synagogue community in Ephesus, he calls them the Jews. That helps us to understand some of the inconsistencies in John's use of the label. Not all of the Jews are equally hostile. Some actually respond positively to Jesus. But overall, the trend is for the label to be used for those who harden in their opposition to Jesus, those who label him dangerous. Since the self-proclaimed real Jews have rejected John's audience, denied their Jewishness, John responds by pointing out just who in his gospel story would count as real Jews in the eyes of those synagogue leaders. The implicit argument is that if that's what it means to be a Jew, it's not necessarily a label that John's hearers want. If they have to choose between being accepted as real Jews and being Jesus' people, they should choose Jesus every time, according to John. What's crucial in all of this is that John and his community are a tiny, vulnerable minority within Ephesus. The Jewish community was a minority to begin with, but they enjoyed a strong position in Ephesian society. The Jews of Asia Minor had been established in cities like Ephesus for generations. They had beautiful synagogue buildings, some with lavish marble paneling, often built in the heart of the city center. Those Asian Jews had supported the Emperor Augustus in the Roman Civil War and had been rewarded afterward with legal privileges, like the right to export money to their homeland and freedom from the demand to worship the emperor. Some Jews were poor, but some enjoyed wealth and prestige, contributing to civic building projects and holding public offices. This isn't to say that there was never ethnic tension with the local Greeks, but there was no anti-Semitism in the sense of a specific prejudice against Jews. If the Jewish minority in Asia Minor faced prejudice sometimes, it was the same prejudice faced by any subcommunity that had come from elsewhere. Egyptians, Ethiopians, Gauls, etc. People in ancient cities were all a bit racist and xenophobic by today's standards. But Jews in Asia Minor seem to have done pretty well. When the early Christians were expelled from the synagogue communities, though, they were thrust into a much more vulnerable and precarious position. It wasn't generally illegal to be a Jesus follower, but it became much harder for Christians to avoid things like the worship of the emperor without the suspicion that they were traitors to the city. Jews could be excused for being a little different. They were already a different people with their own laws. Peculiar, but they had a place in society. These little groups of people who met early in the morning, though, worshipping some executed criminal, refusing allegiance to the emperor, they didn't have a place. And once they weren't categorized as Jews, they increasingly made their neighbors nervous. No surprise that around this same time, in the letters of the younger Pliny, we hear about the first deliberate attempts by a local governor to stamp out Christianity in precisely this region. In many ways, then, what John's Gospel does is help that vulnerable community to establish a new identity apart from the synagogue. Speaking from a position of trauma and vulnerability, the rhetoric against the Jews is understandable. The first Christians were taking the accusations against them, taking their experience of rejection, and turning it into a badge of honor. Fine, we're not Jews, they were saying, but we don't care. We've got something better. That was an important part of their survival as a community. Unfortunately, that same rhetoric came to be used very differently once the tables had turned and Christians occupied the seats of power in the Roman Empire. It's a tragedy that Jewish communities around the Roman world suffered at the hands of Christian rulers in a way that they never had under pagans. It was Christians who gave birth to true anti-Semitism, singling out Jewish communities as a scapegoat for all kinds of problems, viewing them as eternally cursed by God. Jews all too often found themselves shut out of public life, pushed out of their homes, robbed of their property, and even killed. Where Muslims conquered formerly Christian regions, Jewish life again usually improved. But in Christian Europe, the Jewish minorities continued to suffer as second-class citizens, never free from the specter of church-sanctioned violence. Major thinkers like Augustine and Martin Luther wrote hateful things about Jews as an ethnic group, often regarding them as, again, cursed by God. And all of this culminated in the 20th century in the Shoah, the murder of millions of Jews in Nazi ghettos and death camps. The history of Christian anti-Judaism is a grim stain on our collective conscience, one that I believe we have only just begun to come to grips with. Why do I bring it up here? Because John's rhetoric against the Jews has all too often fed that anti-Semitic violence and hatred. For a weak minority to label the more powerful group that rejects it, that's one thing. For a powerful majority to label a minority, that becomes something else. Being in a position of social power requires a different kind of responsible speech, and generally Christians haven't recognized that our own position is different from that of John and his Ephesian audience. So as we read John's Gospel, it'll be important to continually remind ourselves why John feels the need to label some the Jews and cast them often as villains. John was helping his audience survive a time of collective trauma, a time when the Jewish community was a large, strong, and far more confident group. Their task at that moment in history was first and foremost to fashion an identity for themselves after their Jewish identity had been denied. Our task now is very different. We may be in a strong position in society, or our position may be weak. In either case, though, our issue is not rejection by a large, more powerful synagogue. Even if we suffer ourselves, it's our responsibility to serve and help those who are also weak and vulnerable, including contemporary Jewish communities. All of this means that Christians today can't simply mimic John's rhetorical talk about the Jews. That would be deeply irresponsible. By paying attention to the context of John's audience, though, by recognizing how our situation is different from theirs, we can be responsible about how we use and adapt John's language. Am I reading out a passage in church that condemns the Jews? I can be responsible and explain to the congregation why John was talking this way. Am I meditating on a passage like this myself? I can be deliberate about reminding myself about the crisis in which John was speaking. And aware of how John's language has been abused, I can go out of my way to fight anti-Semitism in general in our contemporary world. This gives us just one glimpse into how an understanding of the context of John's audience helps us not only to understand more of the depth of what John was trying to do in his book, but also to apply that understanding more effectively and more responsibly in our contemporary setting. Thanks for watching. I'm Ian Scott, and I'm Associate Professor of New Testament at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, Canada. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to click the like button and think about subscribing to my channel.